Was an astonishing degree of support for the IRA in the War of Independence in New York. There was support from New York Police Department, from the labor unions, was support from the Catholic Church. Over the summer of 21, the truce is declared with Britain. That's all well and good, but there's no truce in the hunt for O'Connor. They are going to get him.
Okay, very good. Mark, thank you very much for sitting down and enjoying with me. I finished off the book last night. It's a fantastic read. Anyone who's into Irish history, particularly War of Independence, even if you've read like the existing stuff on the War of Independence, there's plenty to learn about this. You might tell us a bit about your own background, how you came to be so interested in this kind of event and time that you wrote a book about it.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, John. Great to be here. And essentially, I got into this because I had written an earlier book called The Sons of Molly Maguire, which was about the origins of this, secret agrarian society in Ireland that popped up right on the eve of the famine, and then kind of migrated to the coal fields of Pennsylvania in the 1860s. So I was always interested in the Mollys because there are like 5 generations of Irish mine workers on my mom's side of the family. And they all came from South Ulster, Cavan, Fermanagh, those areas where the Mollys were most active in Ireland. And when my mother's family came to this country, they settled in a place called Cass Township, Pennsylvania, which was a mining area. And that happened to be the cradle of the American branch of the Molly Maguires. So I was always kind of interested in how the Mollys got started, if anybody in the family was involved, and that kind of thing. And I ended up writing a book about it. And one of the reviews of Sons of Molly, I think it was in Irish Historical Studies. It was a nice review, but it mentioned in passing one of Peter Hart's books about Cork. And so I went to read that book and was astonished to find a 1-sentence reference to the IRA shooting an informer in New York. Now, I work for the New York Times, and I have access to our electronic, database going back to 1851. And in fact, I used to write a regular history feature for the Times about like the first mentions of famous people and things in the Times. Might be like the cheeseburger or Winston Churchill or, whatever. And so I knew my way around the archives. And when I saw this mention of an informer getting shot in New York, it was easy to dig up the story. And there it was, splashed across the front page. It was a very big story at the time. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was a banner headline in some other city newspapers. And the accounts were very, very detailed. There were lots of witnesses to this shooting. And so once I saw that, I was kind of, intrigued. And I dug up I didn't realize it, but just searching online, I found out that the Irish Military Archives has witness statements from former IRA men, and they're all online. And there was a very detailed account from the trigger man, Danny Healy, in the New York shooting that was online. And I read that, and I just said, "Oh my God, this is like an amazing story." The Irish Archives the military archives had redacted about a page of Dan Healy's witness statement to the Bureau of Military History. And it was the one page where he actually described, pulling the trigger and shooting this informer, Cruxy O'Connor. And I thought, I understand why they did this back in the 50s when they took the statement, but everybody's been dead for decades. So I sent the military archives an email saying, "Hey, is there any chance you think you might be able to give me this redacted, portion?" And I thought that one of a few things would happen. They'd either say no, or they'd say, "Fill out these 15 forms and send us $700, or we'll take this under review and get back to you in 9 months." But much to my surprise, when I woke up the next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened the phone. There's an email with the redacted portion from the Irish Military Archives. And I've never seen a government move that quickly on any request for information. And I've been in the newspaper business for 4 decades. So, kudos kudos to the Irish Military Archives.
Very good. You actually mentioned there about the shooting itself. We'll get to that. The shooting itself made the front page. I mean, the headline on the front page. But even one of the ambushes that O'Connor was involved in back in Cork, which he was kind of involved in, that actually made the front page of the New York Times. That of all the things in the book, that was one of them that stood out the most to me, because it wasn't even one of the biggest ambushes of the War of Independence, but yet over here it would make a headline. That shocked me.
Yeah, I think the reason that ambush made the big headline, it wasn't so much the death count, it was the size of the forces involved. There were it was a big action in terms of personnel. There were scores of IRA men from a couple of different flying columns involved. So I think it was more, the scale of the attack than, the casualty numbers on either side.
Right. And with that in mind, actually, I was looking up some of the stats. I know obviously the migration caused by the famine, it had a huge effect on Ireland, but also America. When you look at some of the numbers, I mean, what was it? Apparently in the decade following 1945, there was nearly 1 million. There was 900,000 Irish immigrants into New York alone. Now all of them obviously didn't stay there, but there was loads of immigration afterwards. In the 1940s, nearly half of all immigrants to this country were Irish. You might give us like a little bit of an impression of how much support existed here in New York for the war that was raging at home.
There was an astonishing degree of support for the IRA in the War of Independence in New York. There was support from the New York Police Department. There was support from the labor unions. There was support from the Catholic Church. At one point, this was a fact that astonished me. There's a church here in Manhattan that was run by Carmelite brothers from Ireland, and they were very active in supporting gun running. They were so active in supporting gun running that at one point they had so many guns stacked up in the sacristy that they were afraid the floor was going to give way. So they had to move them to the basement. It was, there were 500 Tommy guns stored in this church. There was a union leader in New York who was active in the Marine Engineers Union. And so he had a lot of connections on the waterfront, and he organized this effort to smuggle 500 Thompson machine guns into Ireland. And They went from the manufacturer to a like warehouse in the Bronx, and then they were moved to this Catholic church in Manhattan, and then they moved to they were loaded in burlap bags and taken to a motor launch on the Hudson, and from there to this ship that was docked in Hoboken, and they got 500 guns aboard. Those guns, if they had reached Ireland, would have had an immediate and very huge impact on the war for independence. It didn't work out for a number of reasons, one of which was that there was an assistant cook on the ship who was not in on the plot, and he saw this burlap bag outside the galley, and I guess thinking it was a sack of potatoes or something, slid it open, and much to his surprise, found the muzzle of a Thompson machine gun and started screaming bloody murder. So you had these Union guys who were very involved. At one point in 1920, the longshoremen here, the dock workers, went out and strike, and they refused to handle any British shipping. So the labor movement was very involved. Elements of the Catholic Church were very involved. The NYPD, the police department, well, I shouldn't just limit it to the NYPD, because
Hoboken too, yeah.
the Hoboken Police Department and basically the entire government structure in Hoboken was run by Irish Americans who were supporting the gun running effort, to the point where when U.S. Customs officials confiscated those 500 Thompson guns and pulled them off the ship, the Hoboken Police Department showed up and confiscated those 500 Tommy guns from the customs men. And then there was this ridiculous and in some ways hilarious court battle over who would get the guns. The folks who were doing the gun running came up with this story that they had actually been stolen from their rightful owner and put on that boat by some thief, and therefore the Hoboken cops should be in charge instead of the customs people. But that was just a crazy story. There were New York patrolmen, New York members of the New York Police Department who would ride shotgun when trucks full of guns and ammo were being moved around New York and were headed for the docks, just so that if they got stopped, because you have to remember this was all happening during Prohibition, and the police were very suspicious of trucks carrying illegal cargo, and because they figured it was booze, instead of bullets and guns. But there was one case where a carload with, I think it had 17,000 rounds of ammunition in it, got stopped, and the IRA man who was behind the wheel assumed he'd be safe in the hands of an NYPD officer, because the police department was so heavily Irish at that point. But unfortunately, he was dealing with a Polish American lieutenant rather than an Irish American lieutenant, and the Polish American lieutenant was not at all sympathetic to 17,000 rounds of ammunition being moved through Manhattan. So these guys got thrown in the clink. But by the time they landed in court, conversations had been had with certain high-ranking members of the police department. And so they ended up being charged with some totally minor offense and paid like a $1 fine and were let go. And on the way out of court, several high-ranking Irish American members of the New York Police Department stopped them and said, "Sorry about this. This Polish guy didn't know what he was doing. And by the way, here's a phone number, where you can recover your 17,000 rounds of ammunition." Thank you to the kindly and helpful members of the NYPD. So there was an amazing amount of support. There were politicians involved. There were prosecutors involved. One of the reasons the 3 Cork gunmen got away with it, there were a few reasons for that, but one of them was that a prosecutor in New York, who was a big supporter of Irish independence, helped put the kibosh on the case. He didn't want this thing to go anywhere. So there was a lot of support in the early 1920s. In sharp contrast to the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, during the Troubles. You just didn't see that kind of. There may have been individuals in the NYPD who helped out the IRA during the Troubles. In fact, Jimmy Breslin wrote a great novel, and that was the conceit of it. It was about a patrolman from New York who goes over to Northern Ireland in the 70s and has his eyes opened a bit about discrimination. But you may have had individuals like that, but institutionally, you didn't have the kind of backing that you did in the 1920s. It was really eye-opening.
That story, the book goes into it in a lot more detail, but that story about the kind of doomed Tommy guns, fascinating. The book itself is full of like sub stories. Like I said before we started recording, like I probably read like most of the literature on War of Independence, but even then I learned so much. Some of these small little things we might get into. I guess the book kind of focuses on 4 men. There's Patrick O'Connor and there's the 3-man hit team. So yeah, you might go into like their backgrounds for us, how they led to this confluence up in 83rd Street next to Central Park.
Yeah, 84th and Central Park West. Yeah, the interesting thing is that these 4 guys were all members of the same IRA unit. They were all from the same neighborhood. So they had known each other, for a long time. This is not like, a bunch of guys just thrown together into a military unit from different backgrounds and everything. They were all from, the Sunday's Well portion of Cork. And so you had Cruxy O'Connor. His real name was Patrick O'Connor or Paddy O'Connor. A lot of people in Cork call them Connors, which is not unusual. My mother was an O'Connor, and people always called my grandfather Jim Connors, and so Cruxy is better known in Cork probably as Connors rather than as O'Connor. But he was an interesting guy in a very weird way. I mean, he kept switching sides. He started off as a spy for the Crown. At some point, he stopped providing information to the authorities and switched to the IRA. And he killed at least one. Ironically, he killed an informer. He executed an informer for the IRA. And he was a member of a flying column. Took part in that big ambush we were talking about earlier at Coolabokig. Forgive me if I mispronounced the name, but and he had oddly a real mania about prostitutes. He would get into fights with prostitutes if they said anything to him as he was passing them on his way to work. He beat up at least 2 prostitutes. And then after he joined the IRA, he enlisted the Cork Brigade in his campaign against prostitutes, and in fact was convinced them to conduct a roundup. And So he and another IRA man from the neighborhood, Stan Barry, they got a van and they went around, they rounded up several, I think it was like 6 prostitutes or suspected prostitutes, and uh, carted them off to one of these Magdalene laundries. And Stan Barry's, in his account of what happened, he said O'Connor was all for beating these women. And Stan Barry said, I treated them all like a perfect gentleman. But yeah, he was a weird guy. He had a real mania about prostitutes. He was eventually caught with a handgun on his way to church and turned informer and got 6 IRA men killed when the Black and Tans raided a safe house in Ballycannon outside Cork City. So he was kind of complicated guy. The 3 men who came after him were interesting. There was Pa Murray, whose real name was, they called him Pa because his initials were PA for Patrick A. Murray. He was a student at University College Cork, and then joined the IRA. And there was also Martin Donovan, who of the 3 was older. He was in his early 30s. He was the very first of the volunteers in Cork City, back when the volunteers were formed in, what was that, 1914? Yeah, he was the first guy to sign up. And then there was Danny Healy, who was the trigger man in the New York shooting. And he was an interesting guy. He was a veteran IRA gunman who had been in on any number of operations. He had helped. He was on the team that assassinated the provincial police commander in the Cork County Club, guy named Smith or Smythe. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And what interested me about Danny Healy was, well, he did this very detailed account of his activities in the IRA for the Irish Military Archives, the Bureau of Military History. And he froze immediately after the shooting. And there's this interesting scene where and you know what's going through his mind, because he told this to the historians. He's not in Ireland. He's not in Cork. He's in New York. And it was a fine spring evening when the ambush took place. And there were a lot of people out walking, and so there was a horde of people like staring at him as he shot O'Connor. And then they started to chase him. And there was a getaway car ready for him to hop into, just get the hell out of there. And after he froze immediately after the shooting. And then Martin Donovan yells to him, "Run for it, Danny, run." And so he starts running, but instead of getting in the car, he just runs and runs. And he's clearly not thinking straight. He's kind of out of his element. And this mob of people starts chasing him because they think it's an underworld hit in New York. They think it has something to do with, I guess, bootlegging or prohibition or whatever. They're not thinking, Irish Republican Army. And so there's like 50 people chasing him. And Martin Donovan, who had to toss his gun earlier when it misfired, so he doesn't have a gun on him, and he knows he's got to stop this crowd from chasing Danny Healy. And he does it alone. He climbs out of the car and he faces this crowd. There's like close to 50 of them, and there's one of him. And he's got to pull off a bluff. So he reaches into his pocket as if he's got a gun in there. And he says to the guy who's leading this posse, "Where do you think you're going? Are you looking for trouble?" And the guy stops in his tracks and looks at Martin Donovan and turns on his heels and starts heading in the other direction. So it's kind of this amazing scene where Martin Donovan like faces down, an unarmed Martin Donovan faces down, you know, dozens of people. So he was an interesting character. I think he felt some loyalty. I think he felt a lot of loyalty to Danny Healy because he was the one who talked Healy into joining the operation. And I think he felt responsible for him. And later, when it was all over, you know, this trio from Cork, they went on a little bit of an East Coast tour. They went up to Boston, they went down to Philadelphia, and then it was time to go home. And Danny Healy was warned that the authorities might have his name. So he couldn't get on. They had booked passages for the three of them on a boat. And he was told not to go on a boat, and they would have to make alternative arrangements. And Martin Donovan, I get feeling responsible for Danny Healy, passed up his passage on this boat and stayed with Dan Healy in New York until they could stow away as coal stokers on a transatlantic liner. So that relationship between those two was kind of interesting too.
It's funny, those guns that you mentioned, the ones that were used in the attack, they were actually provided by someone who tried to get the Tommy guns over. His name was Jimmy McGee.
Yes, yeah. And Jimmy McGee was quite a character. He, in fact, one of his, I think it was his grandson, got in touch with me after he read the book. But you know, McGee got put in charge of this huge operation. He needed to get a whole boat. The scheme was to get a ship, and the cover story would be that they were going to bring a load of coal to the people in Dublin who had been left destitute by the rising, or by the rebellion. But the scheme was that coal was only going to be there to cover the 500 Tommy guns. So McGee had to find the right ship, and he found a ship, and he had to get the guns on board. He was not the biggest advocate of this plan of sending them all over, kind of like one big throw of the dice. But Michael Collins wanted those guns, and he wanted them badly, and he wanted them like yesterday. I mean, there was a desperate shortage of guns. The IRA really needed these guns. They even had a plan drawn up. I didn't get into this in the book, but they had a plan drawn up for how many guns would be allotted to each county out of the 500. Yeah, McGee kept warning the other folks who were involved, this is going to be really tricky. And it was. I mean, one of the complicating factors for him is that the union of which he was a leader was on strike at the time. So they're trying to get these guns on a boat, on a ship, but there are picket lines up all over the waterfront, and they're his union's picket lines, and he can't be seen anywhere near a ship because his union's on strike. So that really complicated, matters for him. And at at one point, some of the sailors who he had recruited for this job, went back to him and said, maybe we ought to, after they got the guns on the boat, some watchmen found a few of them after that assistant cook slid open that burlap bag. He started screaming bloody murder, and some watchmen came on board. So some of the sailors went back to Jimmy McGee and said, we got to get the guns off the boat. Well, it was to get those guns on the boat, they had to get them past the New York Police Department. They needed to get them past the Harbor Patrol. They needed to get them past Customs. They needed to get them past the watchman hired by the ship's owner. And they needed to get them past his own striking union. So offloading them and then reloading them was going to be a really complicated situation. And it didn't happen. But that whole tale is just, it's an insane tale.
I was going to say, I say this with almost every book whose author I've interviewed in the last year, to the point where it's almost a cliche, but my God, like when I was reading this, I was thinking like Netflix series, this would be perfect. This would be perfect for like 8 or 10 episodes. That kind of 1920s Peaky Blinders aesthetic is very much in at the moment too. People would love it. It's written, I mean, you couldn't make this story up. Like it almost sounds like fiction,
Yeah. It's a wild story. That the poisoning attempt in Victoria Barracks, that was just that was crazy. There's a professor at University College Cork who is an expert on this era, John Borgovino, and he tipped me off about that poisoning episode. He said,
just for context, I've read it, but for the audience, we're talking about a poisoning attempt on Patrick O'Connor.
Yes. When he was in the IRA, tried to poison him while he was in British custody in Cork in the Victoria Barracks, and the woman who led the attempt by by posing as his mother to deliver a home cooked meal. And the description of the meal was that there was quote, enough strychnine to poison a regiment in this meal. So this woman dressed up as Mrs. O'Connor, and she had the shawl, and she had the basket, and meanwhile a bunch of IRA men detained the real Mrs. O'Connor. But this professor at UCC said, you have to check out her this woman's pension application. It's online. She applied for a pension for her service in the IRA, and there's a very detailed description of her activities. So I got this account of how she dressed up as Mrs. O'Connor and carried this poison meal into the heart of British power in Cork from this pension application. And it was just tremendous. And, she had a very close call when the real Mrs. O'Connor broke away from the IRA squad that was supposed to detain her and marched off to the Victoria Barracks. And as the fake Mrs. O'Connor was leaving the barracks, the real Mrs. O'Connor was marching in because she knew that something was up. She knew they were going to try and do something to her son, and she got there just in the nick of time to prevent him from eating the meal. But the book is just filled with crazy stories like that. The intelligence war in Cork was amazing. I mean, people always think of spy versus spy and like Berlin in the 1960s, you know. Cork in the early 1920s was the equivalent of Berlin in the 1960s.
And speaking of women, a huge chunk of the intelligence gathering side of the thing was done by women. Most famously, the Bloody Sunday in 1920, when when that lot of fairly elite British operators came over, and I believe it was a note found by like a housemaid in a bin that tipped them off to where they were, and then they were able to go slaughter them.
Yeah,
Um, what else was I going to say to you? Okay. Oh, sorry. So, from the time Patrick O'Connor betrayed his unit and got 6 or 7 of them killed, up until the point where they got their revenge, there's he might take us through that time, and it kind of it shows how much they really wanted him. You know, they made like multiple attempts. They did not give up on him. You know.
yeah. Um, I I'll get into that. One thing I do want to mention, one really interesting thing about the timing, which was he got his 6 IRA comrades killed at Ballycannon on, it was during Easter week. It was the Wednesday of Easter week, Spy Wednesday. And if I ever, if they ever make a movie out of this, I think the title should be Spy Wednesday. But when the IRA shot him, when they ambushed him in New York, it was, they got him on the Thursday of Holy Week. And in fact, Danny Healy commented on that. He said, a year and a day later after. And so I think that was kind of deliberate. I think they wanted to time it that way as kind of a message. Now, according to the regular calendar, it was not a year and a day, but according to the church calendar, it was, right? So in between, when these guys get killed, the 6 guys get killed during the raid on the farm in Ballycannon. So after the poisoning attempt, the Brits try to, well, they don't try to, they get O'Connor out of Cork. They ship him off to London. And, you know, given the number of Irish in London, it's not long before the IRA tracks him down, because he runs into the sister of one of his IRA comrades, a guy who served in the Flying Column with him on a street in London. And they just kind of like strike up a conversation, like, you know, how's it going? What's up? You know? So, and he's also mailing letters to his family, which are being intercepted and read. So the IRA dispatches Danny Healy and another guy to Hammersmith in London because O'Connor is supposed to pick up a letter from his family there. But somehow the British get word that there are a couple of IRA men stalking him. So he leaves London and goes to Liverpool, takes a ship to America with his brother, and they settle in New York. Now, back in Cork, over the summer of 21, the truce is declared with Britain. And that's all well and good, but there's no truce in the hunt for O'Connor. They are going to get him. So they have to, they know he's gone to New York. They had a mole in British headquarters, Joe Marchment, whose story is absolutely fascinating. And after the truce, she escorts her sister to a ship that is sailing from Cork or Cove to New York, and they know that O'Connor's family is going to be on the ship. So Joe Marchman's sister gets on the ship to kind of help track them and him. And so they eventually get, and then they get word that he's working at a department store in Manhattan. So once they have that, they send Paul Murray, Martin Donovan, and Danny Healy over, and they then have to begin the hunt. They do a stakeout at the department store, but O'Connor apparently spots them because he stops showing up for work. And then they maintain the stakeout at the department store for a while, but he's just not showing up, and they finally figure out how to track him down, and they do. But they're there for several months. They're in New York for several months, from January through April. So
the book goes into the book goes into like the actual assassination in great detail and the chase and everything. There's a slight irony that on his deathbed, which wasn't really a deathbed, it was a pavement outside Central Park. Even then, he actually was asked who shot him, and a famous rat didn't rat for his last words. There's something kind of funny about that.
Yeah, it's at one point I describe him as the spy who stopped spying, the gunman who stopped shooting, and the informer who stopped informing. He was a hard guy to figure out.
There's another. I'll let you go there soon enough. Again, one of these like small kind of sub stories in the book. Is a similar story to this one in that there was a traitor. In this case, it was the IRB. It was in the 1880s, and they did something similar where they went and tracked down a traitor. You might tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that was a really interesting case. So there was a double assassination in Phoenix Park in Dublin. It was Britain's top representative in Ireland and his number two man. And there was some breakaway faction of the IRB, and they killed these guys with surgical knives. And of course, there was, this was probably one of the most sensational assassinations in Irish history. I mean, it was in a very public place, and it's in Phoenix Park as the two highest ranking British officials, in Ireland. So there was an intense investigation, and they picked up a guy named Carey who eventually talked to save his neck, and he gave away several accomplices who were all hanged. And but then they had to get Carey and his family out of Ireland, and so he was shipped off to South Africa. And while he was on a ship off of South Africa, he was shot by a fellow named O'Donnell from Donegal, who had a very interesting resume. O'Donnell's family had moved to the anthracite region of Pennsylvania, where the Molly Maguires were very active, violently fighting the all-powerful coal companies and their private army and their, private detectives and everything. Several members of O'Donnell's family were killed by a vigilante mob after a private detective infiltrated the Molly Maguires. The husband of another O'Donnell cousin named Jack Keogh was hanged as supposedly the head of the Molly Maguires. So O'Donnell had no love of informers and spies. And in fact, there were reports. Somebody wrote a letter to the editor of a paper that said, that O'Donnell himself had been a top man in the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. So he was arrested, convicted, and hanged for killing this informer like thousands of miles from Ireland. It's not totally clear whether O'Donnell was acting on his own behalf or on behalf of an organization like the IRB or this breakaway group, the Invincibles. It kind of comes down to what people heard right before the shooting took place. Some people heard one thing, some people heard another thing. But the New York shooting was not the first time that an Irish informer was that vengeance was taken upon an Irish informer, thousands of miles from home.
Okay, so as a final thing on the back cover of the book and like the description, it says an account of the only officially sanctioned IRA attack ever conducted on American soil. Can I take from that there's been others, but they just haven't been sanctioned? Do you know anything?
Well, I mean, things have happened. The attack in New York was paid for by IRA GHQ. Michael Collins authorized it. In fact, some of the guys on their way to America, they went to London with Collins as part of the contingent that was going to negotiate the treaty. So we know that Collins had approved this thing. It was totally approved and on high. There have been a few things that have happened in the United States. They didn't involve IRA members coming to this country. But for example, during the Troubles, I think in the early 1970s, there was an incident where a letter bomb got mailed to the British Embassy in Washington, and I think a secretary there lost a finger or two when she opened it. Now, technically, the British Embassy in Washington is not U.S. soil. It's British soil. Nobody. There was no claim of responsibility for that. We don't know for absolute certain that it was an IRA thing. There was an IRA unit in London that was sending out letter bombs at the time. So it was most probably their work. But was it, did someone on the Army Council say, yeah, it's okay to send letter bombs to the United States? We don't know that. We do know that that Collins authorized this shooting, and again, that didn't involve people. It didn't involve boots on the ground in the United States.
I got you. Very good. For anyone who's listened this far, please buy the book. It's absolutely brilliant. It goes into way more stories and more detail than we've spoken about. We just kind of painted like the broad strokes. And if anyone listening happens to work for Netflix or HBO or someone, please make this into a series. It'll be great. Anything you want to leave us with there?
No, I just want to thank you for having me on. This was great. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time. If you ever write anything in similar theme, I'd love to speak again about it.
Sure.